it's not possible to eradicate an idea, and Hamas is also an idea of Islamism and of the destruction of Israel and its replacement with an Islamic State. You can't destroy that idea. You also can't really destroy a political movement or organization through the use of military force from the air or the ground. It can move elsewhere.
Now it is reported that at least 50 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli airstrikes on Gaza overnight. Israel has again warned people in the north of the territory to head south. Palestinians in Gaza fear the area will never be habitable again as this conflict continues. Well, we've heard directly from Gaza from Tarneen Hamad, who is an advocacy officer at Medical Aid for Palestinians.
In a nutshell, we are taking fewer showers, we are drinking less, we are not washing anything, we're using plastic cups and plates. And the sad reality is that some people are boiling contaminated water and drinking it. My family and I had to do this one day because we completely ran out of water. And we understand how dangerous and unhealthy this is. We understand that this might cause dehydration and other diseases. But again, and for the 100th times ever, Palestinians in Gaza are left with no other option.
Well, that is a little snippet of life from inside Gaza. Well, Israel has said its full-scale land invasion of Gaza will begin imminently, but the region's status after that remains unclear. Let's speak to Jonathan Spire, who's an analyst at the Jerusalem Post and Director of Research at the Middle East Centre for Reporting and Analysis. Good morning.
Good morning.
So first of all, let's talk about what is happening in Gaza right now. How much is going to be left in terms of infrastructure enabling people who've lived in Gaza to return to the areas in which they inhabited before?
Well, I think what we've seen in previous episodes of war in the Middle East is that a great deal of destruction can take place and does take place in the context of modern warfare. That's just unavoidable. That's what, of course, happened when the US-led coalition, for example, was in the process of destroying the Islamic State in Syria, a war that I covered from very close up as a frontline journalist. And what we've seen there is that once the smoke clears, then reconstruction begins. That's what's happening in Raqqa, in Mosul and those cities. And I would have thought that in Gaza, if indeed the government of Israel does carry out its stated goal of destroying the Islamist Hamas Authority in Gaza, then a similar process of reconstruction will begin. I mean, Gaza isn't sort of any different to any other place in the Middle East, and that's what's happened elsewhere in the Middle East. And I suppose that's what will happen there too.
I just wonder who would help with that reconstruction, because I was reading last night that Israel has suggested that actually it's going to, as a long-term aim, sever all links with the territory. And when you think within the context of the energy needs and the supplies that go into Gaza from Israel, that's going to have a really big impact, isn't it, on how Gaza exists and copes after this current escalation?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the Palestinian issue differs from elsewhere in the Middle East in the sense that it gets vastly more attention than often greater suffering elsewhere in the region, certainly in Europe and in North America. So I have no doubt whatsoever that, just as is the case with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, there'll be European and American funds forthcoming. By the way, unlike what happens very often elsewhere in the region, which gets vastly less media attention. So I think when it comes to Western support, Arab support and so on, the Palestinian cause, for various reasons, remains of vastly greater importance to that of other humanitarian issues elsewhere in the region. So I very much doubt there'll be very much to worry about in that regard.
Before, obviously, they get to that point, we know that Israel is saying that a ground invasion is imminent, although clearly they're not going to tell us when that is going to happen. You've mentioned Mosul there. I mean, that's a good example, isn't it? This kind of insurgency, this street-by-street fighting.
Yeah.
Clearly, Israel is asking that anyone who is in the north of Gaza to move south, which they're hoping, of course, will reduce any civilian casualties, but also presumably make it easier for them to operate. It's going to be very challenging facing Hamas fighters on the ground in Gaza, isn't it, for those Israeli forces?
Absolutely, yes. I think the Israeli forces, if indeed a large-scale ground incursion or invasion is undertaken, can expect to have a very tough time in the densely populated alleyways and houses of Gaza. It means we've already seen on October 7th that Hamas is able to use drones creatively, and we saw similarly in Mosul, Islamic State using quadcopters, in order to harass entering forces. we know that Hamas has a very, very extensive tunnel network. After all, Hamas has been the de facto sovereign in Gaza now for 16 years. So there's plenty of time to build that up. So there's effectively a subterranean city, so to speak, underneath the Gaza Strip. They've used anti-tank missiles, RPGs, also creatively rockets. So yes, the full sort of weight of insurgent warfare that we saw in Mosul. Earlier than that, the US forces faced in Fallujah back in 2004. We're going to see, I think, something quite similar to that if indeed the Israeli forces do push forward in the days or weeks ahead.
You talk about that tunnel network and also the military capability of Hamas, but clearly it's nothing compared to the weight of the military capability of Israel. I guess what is different is something that is widely acknowledged is the use of human shields by Hamas. Sorry, civilians as well, obviously.
Yes, indeed. Once again, that is something which was witnessed elsewhere. I mean, in Mosul city, again, which I, like many other journalists, was in there in Mosul on a number of occasions during the offensive. And Islamic State did also, make, in a rather diabolical way, shall we say, the creative use of its own effectively hostage civilian population. Those people hadn't voted for ISIS. ISIS just moved in. And, that's the case also with a lot of the Palestinian population, of course, in Gaza. Yes, undoubtedly, they will be making in the rather ghoulish way, if I can put it that way, that they're noted for, use of human shields, Gazan civilians, and indeed, of course, I have no doubt, Israeli hostages. There's over 200 Israeli hostages inside Gaza now who were, kidnapped and abducted on October 7th. And unfortunately, I've no doubt that Hamas will be seeking to make use of them as human shields too in the context of an invasion in various ways.
I wonder how realistic it is. Israel, obviously, in war, governments have to talk tough. They have to talk up their prospects. That is what everyone would expect. I just wonder this idea of eradicating, annihilating Hamas, how realistic that is. Because obviously there's a chance that Hamas fighters will all stand and fight. But I guess there's also a chance with that huge network of tunnels that they may retreat from Gaza, go somewhere else, sort of build up forces and then try and come back into the territory at a later date.
Absolutely. I think we have to be clear on definitions here. It's not possible to eradicate an idea, and Hamas is also an idea of Islamism and of the destruction of Israel and its replacement with an Islamic State. You can't destroy that idea. You also can't really destroy a political movement or organization through the use of military force from the air or the ground. It can move elsewhere. The Hamas leadership, in any case, are resident in Doha in Qatar. The Hamas leadership, Ismail Haniyeh, Khalid Mashal and the others, they're not underneath. They're not waiting around for the Golani Brigade to arrive or the Israeli Air Force to bomb their dwellings. They're living in beautiful villas in Doha and Qatar. Israel can't wipe out that. But here's the thing. You can wipe out an administration using military force from the ground. History is replete with examples of that. And so I assume that when Israeli spokesmen or spokespeople speak about destroying Hamas in Gaza, what they actually mean is that Hamas is currently the governing authority in Gaza, and that's a situation that you can change using military force. It'll take a lot of it. You'll have to push all the way into Gaza City, but that potentially can be done. So I assume that's what Israel is talking about. Actually doing that also, there's still major question marks about how exactly Israel would undertake that, whether it will have the international diplomatic bandwidth and time afforded to it to actually carry out that operation too. So there's still question marks remaining. That, I think, is a coherent goal, though, but it is important to, I think, be clear and specific about that.
And what are the chances of a more moderate Palestinian government? I mean, if you look to the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is in charge there rather than Hamas. I mean, what are the chances of that kind of happening? Because if we look back at, the past in the conflict, the times when it looked like there may even be a two-state solution or some kind of resolution, it was when the likes of the Palestinian Authority had greater control.
Well, absolutely. And of course, the Palestinian Authority remains the legal custodian of the Gaza Strip. The problem is simply that when Israeli forces withdrew from Gaza in 2005, then as it transpired, and without anybody, I think, particularly predicting it at the time, it turned out that when Israel wasn't around and there was kind of a straight fight, so to speak, between the Palestinian Authority's security forces and Hamas fighters in Gaza, Hamas simply expelled the PA by force. I think there remains quite a big question mark, to be honest, as to whether if Israel, goes into Gaza City and destroys the Hamas-led authority, whether the West Bank Palestinian Authority would even be willing given the optics from their point of view, so to speak, of receiving Gaza on a silver platter from the Israel Defense Forces, whether they'd be willing to play that role. So I think a huge number of question marks also remain regarding what would replace Hamas as a governing authority if indeed Israel destroys the Hamas authority in Gaza. I suspect very much that what eventually comes about won't simply be a replication of the Ramallah Palestinian Authority into Gaza, but will probably be a rather more complex arrangement, perhaps involving some Arab governments and perhaps some Western governments and forces too.